Hello everyone and welcome to this session of the CAT's second webinar in this Geoeconomic series. My name is Jacqueline Kagume and I work at the Institute of Economics based in Kenya. And it's my distinct honor and pleasure to welcome you all to this session. So our discussion today is particularly relevant and timely given the current global landscape that we see increasingly being shaped less by traditional diplomacy and more by the strategic use of economic tools as instruments of influence and power for states' alignment and cooperation, but also various risks. So to discuss this further and to share further insights on this issue, I'm joined by a panel of expert speakers whom I'll introduce now. Who have also participated.
Would you like to wait until I have finished my opening remarks, Jackie?
Yes, I'm coming to that shortly.
Okay, sorry.
Just a second.
Please carry on.
Yes, please. Yes, so we have, as part of the introductions, we have Dr. Kirit Parikh, who is the chairman of the Integrated Research and Action for Development. And then second, we will have Ms. Hannah Al-Wakil. I think you can confirm if she's here present today, who is a research assistant at the LSE Firoz Lalji Institute for Africa. Then third, we have Professor Garth Lepere, I hope I pronounced that correctly, who is a professor of international relations at the University of Pretoria. And lastly, we have Dr. Christy Tsunzu, who is a director at the Taiwan ASEAN Studies Center. So, but before we get into the substantive discussion, I'd like to warmly welcome Mr. Pradeep Mehta, who is the Secretary General of CATS International, to deliver some welcoming opening remarks. So you're welcome, Mr. Mehta.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And let me add to your warm greetings, everyone, and to welcome you to this particular webinar, which is the second in the series, in the series that we have launched on Geoeconomic Monograph on global strategies in the age of geoeconomics, or as we have come to call it, GSAGE. Today's gathering brings together remarkable minds from South Africa, the United Kingdom, Taiwan, and India. Each of our contributors has produced a chapter that not only enriches our GSAGE monograph series, but I would venture to say it speaks directly and urgently to the world we are navigating right now in April 2026. As was noted by Jacqueline in her opening remarks, this is a very peculiar time that we are now facing. Having said that, let me come back to the project. We launched this project with a simple but profound conviction that the old vocabulary of international relations, geopolitics, and trade rules are no longer sufficient. We need a new grammar. And that grammar, as our speakers today will show us, is geoeconomics. When we designed this series, we drew attention to the fact that economic instruments such as trade, technology, finance, supply chains, and critical minerals are increasingly being deployed as tools of geopolitical power. That observation, which some found overrated at the time, had since been vindicated many times over. Canada's Prime Minister, Mark Carney, speaking at Davos earlier this year, put it sharply that we are witnessing a rupture and a transition. This is not a recalibration of the existing order, it's a fundamental break. The multilateral trading system, painstakingly built over 8 decades, is fraying. The WTO's appellate body remains paralyzed. The most favored nation principle, the very bedrock of non-discriminatory trade, is being openly questioned by both the United States and the European Union. Unilateral tariff measures, economic nationalism, and the weaponization of supply chains have replaced the collegial rulemaking of an earlier era. We are no longer friends, we are all sort of rivals. And yet, this is a vital point. The response cannot be despair. It must be a strategy to recover from what we have lost. The chapters we hear today from are precisely that, strategic thinking from regions and economies that have everything to gain from getting geoeconomics right. Let me first turn to Africa. and to the two chapters that interrogate from different but complementary angles how the continent must respond to this turbulent geoeconomic moment. Professor Garth Lapierre, a very old friend, writing from the University of Pretoria, invokes Edward Luttwak's famous formulation that geoeconomics is the logic of conflict and the grammar of commerce. He applies this lens to the AFCFTA, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, and asks what it truly means for Africa's strategic autonomy. His argument is powerful. The AFCFTA is not merely a trade agreement. It is a collective set of economic statecraft. It is Africa's riposte to decades of what he calls collective clientelism. The asymmetric dependencies embedded in economic partnership agreements with the EU and the market access conditionalities under the AGOA of the USA. With 54 signatory states, a combined GDP of $3 trillion and a population of 1.4 billion, yet to exceed the combined population of India and China within 4 decades, set the AFCFTA holds enormous promise. Garth shows us that his promise lies not only just in boosting intra-African exports from 17% today to a projected 52% by 2040, but in shifting Africa from commodity dependence towards value-added productive activity and genuine industrialization. That shift, he argues, is the continent's path to strategic autonomy in a world defined by geoeconomic power. Professor David Luke and Hana Al-Wakil of the LSE Feroz Lalji Institute for Africa take this further by asking a pointed question. What kind of trade agreements does Africa actually need? Their answer challenges conventional trade orthodoxy. They propose a sequencing logic that is as elegant as it is compelling. Regional integration first, strategic openness second, and full reciprocity last. They argue, backed by the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa modeling, that prematurely entering into fully reciprocal agreements with major trading partners before the AFCFTA is consolidated would produce trade diversion and regulatory fragmentation, undermining the very gains the continent is trying to secure. Their call for smart protectionism, time-bound protection of strategic sectors such as agro-processing, pharmaceuticals, and manufacturing is not a retreat from globalization. It is a developmentally informed approach to engaging it. And their call for WTO reform, relaxing the substantial proportion of trade requirements, reforming MFN disciplines, and removing consensus requirements for waivers is a call to restore a rules-based framework that actually serves development. As WTO Director General Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala has emphasized, Africa must be integrated into the world trading system and not further excluded from it. Moving from Africa to South Asia, we turn to one of India's most distinguished economists, Professor Kirit Parikh, Chairman of the Integrated Research and Action for Development. Professor Parikh's paper reminds us that geoeconomics is not only about tariffs and trade agreements, it is also about electrons. Cross-border electricity trade, he argues, has evolved from a technical question of grid connectivity into a full-fledged instrument of economic statecraft, shaping patterns of regional interdependence, market access, and bargaining power. The BBIN framework, which is a framework of 4 neighboring countries, Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, and Nepal, offers a remarkable case study. Nepal and Bhutan sit atop vast hydropower surpluses of potential of 83,000 megawatts and 41,000 megawatt of potential respectively, while Bangladesh faces a structural power deficit. India, with its transparent power exchanges and rapidly expanding solar and wind capacity, serves as the regional energy hub. This complementarity is not accidental. It is a structured geoeconomic asset waiting to be fully leveraged. Results of deeper integration are striking. Kirit's modeling shows that with accelerated power trade, Nepal's GDP could be 39% larger by 2045. with per capita electricity consumption 50% higher. Strong correlates of human development. And in November 2024, Nepal made history by exporting electricity to Bangladesh through the Indian grid, the first ever trilateral power trade in South Asia. But here is the insight that I find most compelling for our G-SAGE framework. Professor Parekh links electricity access directly to the digital divide. He argues that 24/7 reliable and affordable power is not merely an infrastructure question, it is a precondition for digital inclusion, for the demographic dividend, and for competitiveness in an AI-dominated world. Geoeconomics in this reading runs through the power grid. And in the consumer movement, we call it a right to basic need as well. And finally, no discussion of global geoeconomics in 2026 would be complete without addressing semiconductors. And for semiconductors, there is no avoiding Taiwan. Dr. Christy Zhu Hao, I hope I pronounced your name correctly, Christy, Director of the Taiwan ASEAN Studies Center at the Tsinghua Institution for Economic Research, offers us a meticulous anatomy of Taiwan's position at the center of global semiconductor supply chains. Her chapter's title says it all. When the world runs through an island. The numbers are breathtaking. Taiwanese firms account for 76.3% of the global foundry market. TSMC alone supplies advanced logic chips to Apple, Intel, and Samsung. Nearly a fifth of all maritime global trade passes through the Taiwan state. Taiwan's plans to mass produce 2-nanometer chips, the most advanced in the world, were announced for late 2025. Dr. Xu's chapter is not a celebration, however. It is a rigorous stress level of Taiwan's semiconductor resilience. He identifies 4 structural vulnerabilities: energy, with 95.77% of Taiwan's energy imported in semiconductor consumption projected to peak in 2028. Water, with chip fabs facing high water stress risk and a projected supply gas of 680,000 cubic meters per day by 2036. Cybersecurity, with sustained and sophisticated attacks on semiconductor firms, and talent, with a labor shortage of over 34,000 workers in May 2025 and a declining share of STEM graduates. The concept Christie invokes is the silicon shield, captures the dual nature of Taiwan's semiconductor position. It is both an economic asset and a geopolitical vulnerability. For CUTS, a public policy organization with consumer and competition facing at heart, this raises urgent questions. What happens to global consumers and to entire economies if the single node in the supply chain is disrupted? And you know why. What does supply chain resilience actually require? These are not abstract questions. They define the geoeconomic stakes of our era. Distinguished guests, friends, and colleagues, what connects these 4 diverse chapters from Africa's trade architecture to South Asia's electricity grid to Taiwan's semiconductor foundries? This is a question which might arise in your mind. The connecting thread in this, in the age of geoeconomics, economic choices are strategic choices. A tariff schedule is a form of foreign policy and a weaponized foreign policy as well. A power purchase agreement is an act of statecraft. A chip fabrication plant is a geoeconomic asset. The separation between economics and strategy that we once took for granted has collapsed. Flux International launched the G-SAGE series because we believe that developing countries and emerging economies, the regions from which most of our contributors hail, can afford to be passive observers of these transformations. Cannot afford. They must be strategic actors. They must have the analytical tools, the policy frameworks, and the institutional capacity to navigate geoeconomics on their own terms. The 4 chapters before us today and the colleagues who will present them are a contribution to exactly that endeavor. I'm deeply grateful to Garth, to Hannah, David, Kirit, and Christy for their exceptional scholarship and generosity in bringing these insights to our platform, which will be of global utility. I also warmly thank our moderator, Jacqueline Kagume, whose thoughtful stewardship will guide our discussion today. And to all of you on this sitting in the webinar or even outside as participants, thank you for joining us from across the world this afternoon, as in India. Your presence affirms the relevance of this work. Let us now engage with these ideas with the rigor and urgency they deserve. Over to you, Jacqueline.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Mr. Mehta, for those insightful remarks. I think you've given a very comprehensive background, so I'll now proceed directly into the author's presentation, and each speaker will have approximately 8 minutes. Please try and keep to this time, but I'll nudge you gently in case you don't. So with that, we go directly to our first speaker, Dr. Kirit Parikh. You've already been introduced, so please, Dr. Parikh, go ahead, the floor is yours. Please share your insights from your paper with us.
Jacqueline, could you tell the speakers about the time that they have?
Yes, indeed. So you have 8 minutes, I mentioned. So each speaker will have 8 minutes. And please try and keep to that time. If I'll nudge you if you go over the time, so that we can all keep to the prescribed time frame. So we'll start with Dr. Kirit, who has been introduced. Please go ahead.
I'm talking about what is the role that electricity trade play in economic growth and bridging digital divide in Southeast Asia. Now, we have seen that really that supply chain disruptions can really cause a lot of pain to the rest of the world as well, as we have seen in Hormuz and President Trump's, you could say, tantrums. Anyway, let me just begin with this, that, we know that South Asia is a rapidly developing region where energy underpins its economic growth, industrialization, and living standards. And despite progress, the region faces low per capita electricity consumption, and there are huge gaps. There are people with that persisting digital divide. Unless you have access to electricity, you cannot really have the kind of access to the modern digital world that you would like to have. And I think that is why per capita electricity consumption is very important. Here we have given numbers, but this says the total electricity available in the country divided by total population. So what is exported, what is given, all this is there, but consumption by households is much different than these numbers, and we'll come to that. Okay, let me go to the next slide. Because I have only 8 minutes, I will only quickly say that the total installed capacity largely is about 50% from fossil fuel, and it varies across South Asian countries. By South Asian countries, I mean Bhutan, Bangladesh, India, and Nepal. And so that is what we are talking about. Now, what is the compelling need for regional cooperation and cross-border electricity trade? It increases energy security. It helps us fulfill our NDC targets for the climate thing, the nationally determined targets, and expands access to reliable, affordable, and continuous electricity, which is, I think, essential for bridging the digital divide. To enable efficient use of renewable energy also, you need a balancing supply-demand gaps and grid stability. For that, having access to electricity that does not depend upon sun and wind, etc., is very critical, because solar and wind are not available around the clock. Now, we can see the cross-border trade is really powerful potential is there because the seasonal and daily demand diversity is there in South Asian countries. And you can, uh, the thing is that that Bangladesh, India, Nepal, can trade hydropower and and during peak generation, and Nepal can Bhutan export surplus electricity in summer, but rely on imports of winter when hydro generation drops. They have a large hydro capacity. Now the question is that even some of this hydro capacity they could not uh, easily develop because they don't have the necessary demand. For example, Bhutan has 41,000 megawatt of power potential, hydro potential, and Nepal has 83,000 megawatt. So they're not able to develop this unless there is a market for it. And that market India and Bangladesh can provide. So I think it is really important for their growth and for cheaper electricity and round the clock electricity in India is possible because of this. India is largely coal driven at the moment, though we have a significant amount of renewable capacity as well. Now, when we started this project in way back 10 years ago, 15 years ago, there was hardly any trade between Bangladesh and India. But now you can see that the import from India has grown significantly. And power trade began in 2013 with the commissioning of Bharatpur, one of this HVDC 9. And then I think we have seen that it's really growing, has grown quite rapidly. Now, if we look at the export and import of electricity between Bhutan and India, that is also, it's a large amount of Bhutan exports are taking place and Bhutan imports are less. But if you go further, develop now that the trade has developed a little more, Bhutanese imports have gone up and so on. So if you just see that it's similar to Nepal and India also, Nepal is exporting significantly more now than before, and that its imports have also, because of that, it varies, but it has gone up. But it has really helped Nepal provide electricity to everyone, to even rural areas other than the big cities. And I think that has also provided significant benefits to Bhutan as well, the power trade. Because what has happened is that Bhutan has used the revenues in a much more socially relevant manner, and it has provided electricity to everyone. It has built up its renewable infrastructure, and because of all this, Bhutan's now per capita income is higher, 40-50% higher than that of India. So you can see what a change it has brought into Bhutan. I think similarly, when we started this in 2012 or something, the small countries like Nepal were reluctant to trade with India, saying that this is a large country and we'll be subjected to. Did we get what is the assurance that we get a reasonable return on our reasonable price? And then we showed that, look, we are now having a market-based power tariff determination. Every 15 minutes, the power is shown on the internet website, so you can know that really what is happening, and that you can trade on that as well. And we have now made it possible for Nepal and Bhutan, Nepal, Bangladesh to trade on India's power exchanges, and so that so that they are clear that they are getting what really good market determined prices. Now, we had Irade model that we used was really many elements were there. We had a technology model, we had a macroeconomic models, and we had linked and we had have many, we had sort of iterations between the two to make sure that the demand is consistent with the power and is consistent with, and the growth of the GDP is consistent with what kind of technology you use in power trade. Because the changing in technology for generating power also affects various sectors of the economy and also affects the way incomes are distributed. And it really then also affects what people demand or consume from different sectors. So I think this is the kind of things. And I can suggest some key findings of the study. As Pradeep pointed out, Nepal's hydro potential is a valuable resource. Nepal imports 0.7 billion kilowatt hour in 2020, but by 2025 it is exporting 18 billion kilowatt hour, which increases to 65 billion kilowatt hour in our simulation by 2030 and 130 billion kilowatt hour by 2040. Nepal's annual export revenue from electricity trade becomes 310 billion Nepalese rupees, and it goes on increasing. With accelerated power trade, Nepal's per capita consumption increased by 23% over base, and GDP increases by 39% by 2045. And this is very important because Nepal's growth could not have taken place unless it was able to generate electricity and export it. Because hydropower is one of its major resources in a sense. Now, hydro capacity reaches 34.4 megawatt, and compared to this in the base year. And trade also benefits India by providing easier and cheaper electricity to meet evening peak demands when solar power is unavailable. So you can see that this is a trade, as we really all economists know, mutually agreed trade is beneficial to both sides. And here it's clearly indicated and we have shown. Now, so there is a lot of trade among BBIN countries, Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Nepal, as really significant amount of possibilities are there. And you can just see that by 2034-45, everything increases significantly. And that has a significant impact on the growth of these countries. And of course, I think the electricity availability increases to every household in this region, and that round-the-clock electricity with stable supply is available, and in internet access, and at least are critical to bridging the digital divide, and that becomes possible with this kind of electricity trade. So anyone, access alone is not enough. Of course, education and skills are equally important, and one has to really see that everybody has that kind of education and skills provided. And I think we have about 20-25 years to make sure that everyone has that skill. India has 85% of the household with smartphone ownership in 2025. 95 to 97% of users use smartphones, widely used for banking, education, and entertainment. India has more or less reached electricity down to all 95+% households in the country. So it is, of course, not available at the stable voltage and round the clock, but it is recently expanded significantly. And I think, for example, India has 600 million smartphone users, over 20 billion UPI transactions. That is you transact, pay, and receive, settle bills on internet, on a mobile phone very easily, instantaneously. So this is a united payment interface transactions is enormously very convenient. You don't have to carry money all the time in your pocket. Don't have to worry about change. You can immediately pay these things, enter the name and then of the address of the account number of the person whom you want to pay. Just enter the amount, and give your code number, personal code, which you should keep secret. Money gets transferred immediately. Digital education is key for AI era workforce development, and schools must focus on improving digital learning and skills. Apart from the fact that you have to have availability of electricity round the clock at stable voltage and uninterrupted power source. I think BBI and electricity trade is more than technical cooperation. It's a strategic economic lever that reduces cost, improves energy security, and enables large hydropower projects to assure demand. India's role as a regional electricity hub builds trust through reliable institutions. While Nepal and Bhutan benefit by monetizing power, Bangladesh gains access to gain stable imports, and with that, it is able to provide electricity to everyone in the country. So, in this context, the rising energy demand, digitalization, and decarbonization of South Asia, electricity trade is becoming central to regional growth, stability, and resilience. And we think that that's really critical. That you have to ensure that first to bridge this divide. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Dr. Kirit. We'll move next to our next speaker, who is Ms. Hannah Al-Wakil. Hannah's work has already been introduced, but basically examines how Africa can rethink its trade strategy within the fragmenting global order. And I found some very interesting insights, perspectives on the need for anchoring the development-oriented trade policy in the AfTA, as opposed to pursuit of broad reciprocal liberalization. So we are keen to hear you. Hannah, please go ahead. You have 8 minutes. Thank you.
Well, first of all, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be joining you all today in this timely Cuts Monograph Series. On behalf of Professor David Luke, I'm pleased to present our co-authored paper on rethinking Africa's approach to new trade agreements and WTO reform. So we first start with a simple question. Why rethink Africa's approach to trade? First, Africa remains the world's least developed region, with 60% of those living in extreme poverty being in Africa. Its share of global trade accounts for less than 3%, and it exposed to extreme vulnerability due to food insecurity, with 42% of African countries being net food importers. What those challenges highlights is that African trade is in need of a strategic change. Why now? The current changing global economic context with the dual green and digital transitions, unilateral measures such as CBAM and the US tariffs, as well as the fragile multilateral trading system, make it a particularly opportune time for African countries to reassess their priorities for WTO reform and bilateral trade agreements. So in our paper, we pose 3 questions. First, what kind of trade agreements does Africa need from its global partners to achieve its developmental objectives? Second, how should this align with WTO reform? And finally, what internal trade reforms are essential for Africa's economic transformation? So before setting the direction for the future of African trade, it's important that we first take a step back and assess Africa's current trade landscape. We observe 3 key trends. First, Africa's trading patterns are shifting. Although the EU bloc and China remain Africa's largest trading partners, we're increasingly seeing the engagement of new players across the global south, such as India and the UAE, which their trade engagement has surpassed the US since 2020. We also see expanding intra-African trade since the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area in 2021, which is a great source of economic diversification and extending regional integration among African countries. A second notable trend is what Africa trades. So while Africa's export baskets to its main trading partners remains concentrated in primary commodities, for example, fuels, precious stones, and metals, intra-African trade shows us a different story. It has a more diversified mix of value-added manufacturing goods, including machinery, transport equipment, and chemicals or fertilizer products. And this is a reflection of how regional integration can drive economic diversification as well as strengthen intra-African value chains. Third, and most importantly, Africa's trade future is going to depend on long-term competitiveness, not just market access. To build this competitiveness, we require three elements. First, adaptability, productive capacity, and capturing green windows of opportunity. In response to Trump's tariff announcements in April of 2025, we saw Africa's strong export performance, particularly in apparels and textiles from key players in East Africa, such as Kenya, where the exports increased by 22% since the tariff announcement and up to July 2025, and continued to see a growing trend across 2026. While this can be due to the delays in the tariff announcements, it also shows us that African exporters have a great resilience and adaptability that they can leverage when preferences are disrupted. The second aspect to boost economic competitiveness relies in how we channel our investments. Investments must be dedicated to enhancing sectors with high potential for productive capacity beyond manufacturing. This includes areas such as agro-processing, high-value services, as well as digital infrastructure and pharmaceuticals. And this would enable African firms to operate at scale and integrate in regional and global value chains. Finally, African countries cannot build their economic competitiveness in the current global landscape without joining the green industrialization race and capturing the green windows of opportunity. Although African countries possess the necessary resource endowments, such as critical minerals and natural resources, that situate them at the center of the green transition, they will only emerge as winners from this green transition race if they depend on preserving and expanding the green industrialization policy space. So, with this in mind, we now move to looking forward. What does a new development-oriented approach to trade look like? In our paper, we propose a three-pillar framework. First, looking at new generation trade agreements, they must be development-oriented, strategically sequenced, and anchored in the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. That looks like prioritizing smart, time-bound protection of sensitive and strategic sectors such as agro-processing, automotives, and pharmaceuticals until the competitive capacities of African industries are built under the AFTA. Second, this also looks at how agreements must be strategically sequenced. So instead of rushing into full reciprocity, agreements with third parties must first allow a transitional period until AFTA gains are established to avoid trade diversion as well as regulatory fragmentation. The second pillar we propose is on continent-wide inclusion. Instead of the traditional divides along developmental and regional lines that typically divides the African continent between North Africa and Africa south of the Sahara, which disrupts regional value chains as well as weakens intra-African commercial ties, what we propose is that new agreements must take a continent or a whole of Africa approach to unlock the transformative potential of the continent and align with regional integration priorities. Finally, looking at WTO reform, and in light of the 14th Ministerial Conference taking place in Yaoundé last month, with not really delivering substantive outcomes, it remains very important that African countries must set a clear developmental agenda for WTO reform. So through this, we offer three specific reforms. First, on relaxing the requirement of liberalizing substantial proportion of all trade to preserve the policy space and protect infant industries of African economies. Second, enabling the negotiation of bespoke and tailored development-oriented trade agreements with third parties, given the potential MFN erosion. And finally, we argue for removing the consensus decision-making requirement for WTO waivers, particularly for health-related and technological transfer waivers, to reduce the negotiation asymmetries that consistently disadvantage developing economies. Those three reforms together aim to restore a rules-based framework that is more consistent with Africa's developmental priorities. We also acknowledge that reforming the trade provisions alone, using these three pillars, is not sufficient. What we need is a complementary trade support framework for overcoming structural constraints, such as removing or reforming the non-tariff barriers, mobilizing domestic resources, prioritizing investment in trade-related infrastructure, and taking a coordinated approach towards towards negotiations under the African Union. To break this down a bit further, the trade support framework is divided between Africa's internal behind-the-border reforms, which includes strengthening competition policies, providing support for SMEs through technical and financial means, and facilitating the movement of people to enhance African businesses integrating with each other. And it also sees a role for Africa's trade and development partners to channel or to encourage more and better quality investments that move away from extraction to value-added sectors, to build capacity and technical assistance support, to align whatever is remained of ODA with trade reforms, and finally, to strengthen South-South partnerships. To wrap it up, when rethinking Africa's trade future, we must not rely on preference-based approaches alone, but on building Africa's ability to attract investments, build industrial capacities, and secure a supportive external trade regime. I'll stop here and thank you very much, and looking forward for the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Hannah, for saving us 1 minute. Thanks for that presentation. We move to Dr. Garth Lepere, I hope I pronounced that right, whose contribution essentially situates AfTA within the broader geoeconomic shifts and highlights its role as a strategic instrument for Africa's economic resilience and autonomy in a turbulent global system. So, Professor Lepere, you have the floor. Please, let's hear your presentation.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Thank you very much to my old friend Pradeep for the invitation. So my contribution is titled Geoeconomics in an Age of Turbulence, the African Continental Free Trade Area and Strategic Autonomy. So the focus then is on the importance of the African Continental Free Trade Area in the context of the geoeconomic stresses in the global trading system. And it tries to explain the normative logic and the operational dynamics of the agreement, which is really, philosophically, in a philosophical sense, meant to enhance Pan-African self-reliant growth and development in the context of this quest for strategic autonomy. Now, Pradeep has given you quite generously, thank you, Pradeep, for that, introducing my contribution, the size and scope, of the agreement, covering 54 countries, the size of the GDP, which is around 3 trillion, a population of 1.4 billion, but very crucially, it is now, in terms of the number of participating countries, the largest free trade area in the world. Very important to know. So the strategic autonomy imperatives of the African Continental Free Trade Area can be seen as a collective action endeavor to provide the kinds of shock-absorbing capacity for African countries against geoeconomic fallout in the global trading system and in the context of the current malaise and the existential plight of the World Trade Organization as the global custodian of the rule-based system in trade. So underpinning the ethos of the agreement and the principles underlying what it is meant to achieve is a unity of purpose to establish a continental methodology for more effective participation in global value chains on the one hand, and also to generate welfare-enhancing forms of. So these include innovative trade and investment partnerships, deeper intra-regional trade, globalization, expansive infrastructure services, and industrial development. Importantly, the African Continental Free Trade Area holds great promise for consolidating and expanding the geographic and substantive ambit of South-South trade. So my contribution goes into that in some detail, highlighting, the linkages that the African Continental Free Trade Area can generate in terms of connectivities with regional hubs in manufactured goods and processed commodities, particularly given the quantum in the growth of South-South trade, which now stands at something like 6.8 trillion. That was the UNCTAD figure in 2025. So I do then go into great detail in examining the anatomy of the free trade agreement. It's 77 pages, how it holds together in terms of its protocols in goods and services. That's the first phase. And then it also goes into some detail on the other dimensions of the second phase, which has to do with competition policy, intellectual property, investment, digital trade, and how far we have progressed with the implementation. And I think there's been progressive implementation in relation to goods and services, but there are also the complementary mechanisms that have been managed, I think, quite judiciously as far as rules of origin are concerned. And then there are also the other financing portals, such as the Adjustment Fund, which is meant to provide participating countries, particularly the LDCs, the 35 least developed countries of the continent, with support from revenue losses that come with tariff liberalization. And it's a quite demanding process because the tariff book requires liberalization around 90% of goods. And there's also been, I think, quite substantial progress on the requests and offers on the services trade protocol. So all in all, this is meant, including the guided trade initiative, which is also very important to support meaningful trade with greater private sector participation, involvement in small businesses, providing financing for small business participation through the SME facility in particular. Ms. Al-Wakil, I think, has provided a very insightful tour of what the challenges are, and these are quite substantial. These cannot be ignored. But when it comes to the human and financial resources needed to realize the ambition of the African continental free trade area, I think that commitment is real. I think it is real in terms of advancing the ambition behind the continental integration agenda, particularly in the letter and spirit of previous initiatives, such as the Lagos Plan of Action, such as the Abuja Treaty. And this is taking place, we must remember, in a very complex geopolitical milieu that the African countries, together with the custodians of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, as well as the Secretariat based in Ghana. It is a huge undertaking. But that said, the African Continental Free Trade Area is a game changer as a trading configuration and as an attempt to advance Africa's strategic autonomy. Thank you very much, Ms. Kagume.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Dr. Gath. We come to our final speaker, who is Dr. Christy Sanzu, who is the director at the Taiwan ASEAN Study Center. I'd introduced you. So Christy's paper and work focuses, as you heard earlier, on semiconductors and global supply chains, and illustrates how technological leadership and supply chain control have become central areas of geoeconomic competition. So Christy, you're welcome. Please take the floor.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank the organizer for having me in this very important and also very timely seminar. But I'm going to move away a bit from the subject I have in my article because I think most audience can reach that article. So I would like to provide a different angle of a more relevant and more immediate issues in Taiwan, also in Southeast Asia. So it's more about the international cooperation under the global supply chain related issues. So the year of 2025 has been the year of uncertainty. Following the inauguration of US President Trump in late January, the global economy has seen a series of shocks, from a sharp spike in tariffs to ongoing geopolitical uncertainty and conflicts in the Middle East and Ukraine. Compared with other regions or sub-regions, most, if not all, of the Southeast Asia countries, and India recorded solid growth in manufacturing outputs and goods exports in 2025, despite the above-mentioned various external headwinds. And this was mainly due to strong export to the global market and the U.S., or what here in Taiwan we call the rush export orders and shipment to the U.S. market before the increase of Trump tariffs, and also strong global demand of consumer electronics and semiconductors and the artificial intelligence, the AI boom. The average GDP growth rate of ASEAN 10 countries in 2025 is around 5%. India has more than 7% growth rate, and while Taiwan registered a strongest growth rate at more than 8% for more than 15 years. Given the role of emerging Asian factories in Southeast Asia and India, the growth momentum will very likely continue. However, as mentioned by the moderator, the global and regional economy is increasingly shaped and affected by geopolitical and geoeconomic influence. The rise of the expanding supply chain in Southeast Asia and India in the past 7 years, if I may say, is one of the examples of geopolitical development in Asia, the diversification of supply chain away from the highly concentrated China to Southeast Asia, particularly in Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia, and also India, reflects the country's and enterprises' strategy and intention to de-risk and reduce dependence on just one or a few economies or market. However, while this brings opportunity to developing countries in Asia, emerging issues and challenges also rise, and this includes supportive and consistent policy framework from the governments, business-friendly and market-driven legal framework, access to electricity and water, as already mentioned by the previous speaker, and also talent pipeline, which right now is a very important and also challenging issues in this sub-region, and also cooperation to make sure no or less supply chain disruption. All these are very, very important. In addition, here in Taiwan and some other countries, we find the widening gap of the rich and the poor, and also the development of smaller enterprises. Enterprises also present emerging challenges. In February this year, geopolitical tension escalated into a new conflict in the Middle East, disrupting energy production facility and the global energy transport route through the Strait of Hormuz. In this crisis prolonged will pose new threats and risks to all countries in the region. For semiconductor, which should be the focus of my talk today, and it is already becoming a very strategic policy priority for most of the Southeast Asian countries. Currently, in addition to Taiwan, which hosts the majority of the production of advanced chips in the world, in this region, Singapore and Malaysia host well-developed semiconductor supply chain for more than 50 years. Thailand, Vietnam, the Philippines are catching up with their strength in IC design due to their very young population, and also focus very much assembly, testing, and packaging, the APT. Indonesia, very similar to some African country, it is the largest economy. It has rich critical minerals, and right now it has adopted a downstreaming strategy, meaning it will not simply export the nickel or other critical minerals, but instead it will require companies to invest in Indonesia for processing and abstracting facilities in order to take advantage of its critical minerals. So the development of semiconductor supply chain in Taiwan, together with other neighbors, for the global market, shows exactly the result of globalization and strategic development of global politics, geopolitics. And this development demonstrates a lot of policy issues that can be discussed and shared with other parts of the world, including Africa and also some other South Asian countries, which also wish to move into the global supply chain. So I'll just stop here and look forward to have more interaction with you, focusing on my subject, semiconductor, or the development of the supply chain in this region. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Christy. And thank you to all our speakers for their rich and very insightful presentations. I think they've done a brilliant job at demonstrating the role of geoeconomics and the use of those the shifting changes in the use of those tools in the changing global order, from rethinking from electricity trade, global trade, to rethinking Africa's role, after the policy changes, the reform priorities, and obviously very cognizant of the turbulent times that we are in, to the supply chain controls, all as illustrations of the use of economic tools to shape the current global order. So with that said, I'll go now to a plenary where we'll allow some questions, some Q&A. I don't know if we have any questions from our audience. I do not see any in the chat bot here. Give me a second. So I do not see any questions yet from anyone from our participants, but I think before our participants prepare some questions, I'd start with maybe a follow-up, particularly for the speakers that focused on the Africa Free Trade Area contributions. My first question to you, Al-Wakil and Prof, would be, what would you consider the most immediate policy priorities required to translate that great ambition into tangible economic transformation? You have an eloquent trajectory for change, but if you were to be asked the most immediate policy priorities right now, what would that be? That would be my first question to the two of you, and then I'll follow up with other questions as we wait for our audience. So I think, Hannah, you can go first.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Jacqueline, for the question and for the speakers. It was a very insightful discussion. So on your question, when it comes to implementing Africa's development-oriented agenda, one key priority is looking at industrial policies, because industrial policies are not only going to be necessary in driving Africa towards the green industrialization, but it also allows the continent to leverage its resources as well as critical minerals in a way that can be channeled towards capturing value within the continent itself. So as a first priority to African countries would be to rethink how we approach the process of industrial policymaking itself. Because essentially, it is not about the type of policies we implement, whether it be local content requirements or export bans, but it's about how we approach the process of industrial policymaking itself to unlock its potentials. We actually have Professor David Luke and I have a paper that we recently published in the International Institute for Sustainable Development, which talks about exactly that. And in this paper, we offer a 5-tenet framework to how African countries, as well as countries looking to upgrade their practice of industrial policymaking, and to kind of how to capture the value from it. And those 5 tenets are adaptability, enhancing consultation across civil society organizations, private groups, as well as public sector. It also looks at capacitation, as in we need capacitated institutions as well as financial mechanisms to be able to deliver on our industrial policies. And the last 2 tenets are partnerships-based as well as transboundary nature, which is we need to implement industrial policies that leverage our partnerships with various neighboring countries, both on the continent as well as abroad. And through those 5 tenets or 5 ways of reforming how we think of industrial policy making, we can drive the African continent closer to its development priorities.
Great, thank you. Prof, would you like to come in and add something to that? Dr. Gath?
Yeah, I'm back. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. I would raise 2 issues in terms of the implementation obstacles relating to the African Continental Free Trade Area. The one is the interface with the regional economic communities. As you know, there are 8 regional economic communities, and these are supposed to be the building blocks of continental integration. As a matter of fact, if you look at all the previous templates, from the Abuja Treaty, including a Lagos Plan of Action, the various programs of Agenda 2063, of which the African Continental Free Trade Area is the Starship program. They include or they prescribe a pivotal and a strategic role of the regional economic communities as building blocks. Now, these are very disparate. They are very different in composition. They're very different in terms of their policy architectures, institutional dynamics, etc., etc. The big problem is finding some kind of harmonization among the regional economic communities to which all member states belong. All members, the 49 countries that have ratified the agreement of the African Continental Free Trade Area are also members of regional economic communities. So the logic then is that the membership of these regional economic communities provides some kind of synergistic linkages from national to regional to continental. So it's how do you get those linkages right to embed the letter and spirit of the agreement to drive this process forward. So it's extremely uneven. Even if you look at the contributions of the regional economic communities to intra-regional trade, which stands around 16 to 17% of total trade. The Southern African region, which is the Southern African Development Community, contributes almost half of that total. 52% of intra-regional trade is generated by the Southern Africa region, with South Africa providing much of that gravitational pull. So the issue really is to get a kind of judicious and prudential participation of the RECs and to get them much more functionally ready to participate in this process. The second, if I may, is it is not so much about trade liberalization and the elimination of duties, which is quite important. The big impediment is NTBs, non-tariff barriers, of a regulatory, procedural, as well as a policy nature. As a matter of fact, the Secretariat in Accra, under Secretary General Wamkele Men, has put in place a subcommittee to examine NTBs and how to deal with these, how to address these. They identified 30. There are 30 non-tariff barriers that hinder the progress of to expand the ambit of intra-regional trade, and which are great hindrance. So there is now the political will, as well as the political will and the administrative capacity to address this from the center and to get the 49 countries that have now ratified the agreement to identify which of these 30 non-tariff barriers fit into their trading dynamics and how to address these with some urgency. So those are the two issues I would highlight.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. We do have a question now from the audience. I see Ashutosh asks, my question is to any of the panelists. How can countries align industrial policy with trade strategy to build resilience while remaining competitive in global value chains? And as you think about that response, I also had a follow-up question to Dr. Parikh. Based on your presentation from the South Asia perspective, if you also had to pick one lesson that would be the most important that other regions globally can draw upon from the electricity trade as a model for geoeconomic cooperation, what would that lesson be that can be replicated in other regions? And lastly, my question to Christy, to your point on semiconductors, how best would smaller economies position themselves in highly concentrated and strategic global value chains for better opportunity? So those would be my follow-up questions. And I think I'll begin with you, Dr. Parikh.
About 5 years ago, if somebody had asked me that question, the answer would have been very simple. Open up your economy and then face the competition. But we have seen that the Washington consensus has crumbled over these 5 years. That we have seen that large monopolies in some countries which are dominating the situation. And I think all this is really making it difficult to answer the question, what should be your strategy? One would say that yes, you should protect yourself from really monopolies or countries which support or protect their exports and unduly or unreasonably give them support of one kind or the other. But that's easier said than done, because no matter what you try to do, you will find that it also comes back to hurt you. So I'm not sure that what the answer today would be. I think in my opinion, economists are still struggling to find a via media of Washington consensus, and what to do is what we have seen in the world today, that so many people, so many countries, dominated by few large firms within country and between countries. And we have seen that inequality has been growing. And that really is something that one needs to worry about.
Thank you. Thanks for that response. We go to you, Christy.
Yes, I would like to first respond to the previous question and then to your question on semiconductor. I think we can say that the world right now is facing, especially developing countries that are not yet part of the global supply chain right now, see a very good timing, because China used to be, we call the world factory, and right now it's exceeding and then allow a lot more newcomers. So we do see a lot of emerging Asia factories, African factory, instead of just one very concentrated world factory, and which is China. So that means a lot newcomers are right now have the opportunity to move into the global supply chain. Either it's in garment, textile, in footwear, in electronics, or in semiconductor. As long as the government and also the business sector has a very clear policy goal, which sectors you want to develop, and then you need to have an industrial policy. I see some raised question regarding this, and you need to have a very focused industrial policy together with your trade policy. So I would say that having competitive business is very important, but having a competitive business environment or competitive manufacturing environment is sometimes more important, because that's how you attract multinationals and foreign companies to start building up operations in this country and then help develop the local industry. And that is exactly what Taiwan has been doing with Vietnam, with the Philippines in the past 3 decades. So I think that is about the first questions. And then for your question, I think yes, we do see a lot more country, in addition to the Southeast Asian country. I mean, each of them have their own semiconductor strategy and policy, and they even have this roadmap and also vision for developing semiconductor by year 2030, 2040. And I would say that it is good to have this ambition, but semiconductor supply chain include very different segments. IC design, from critical minerals to IC design to fabrication, which is TSMC, for example, the chip maker, the chip making fab, and also testing and packaging. And also you need to have a lot of materials and also devices to make the operation of the semiconductor supply chain. So I think for smaller countries that have not all the resources to develop whole of the supply chain, you need to focus on 1 or 2 segments. For example, I just mentioned that Vietnam and also Philippines, these are the second and the third they have the second and third largest population among Southeast Asian countries. And each of them have more than 100 million population, which is young and which is very young. And these 2 countries, want to have a whole supply chain, but right now they understand that they need to focus on specific segment. For example, IC design, as I just mentioned. So Vietnam and Philippines right now have a very concrete and specific program on IC design so that they can develop their talents not only for their domestic economy, but also for global market. For example, for Japan, for Taiwan, because the whole world, especially East Asian country, Korea, Taiwan, and also Japan, are hunting for talents. So I think that can be one segment to start with. And those that have not yet manufacturing facility or supply chain, you can start with your critical mineral because in Indonesia, as I mentioned, they right now focusing very much on their critical mineral. They try to build a critical mineral as a very important hub for the neighboring country, which want to develop not only semiconductor, but also for EV, electric vehicle, which right now is also very important. So I would say that have a very focused and clear policy to target certain parts of the semiconductor supply chain based on the talents and also the resources you have. I think that can be one direction, and that can be the starting policy to for some smaller countries. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thank you. Thanks, Christy. As we draw closer to the end, I'm very conscious of time. We have one last question from Eugene. Christy has responded to Ashutosh. So Eugene says, thank you for this wonderful meeting. My question is to any of the panelists. How important is South-South relations to the AFTA? In particular, how can China support Africa's intra-regional trade? So any of you can take this question, but to also allow you to make closing remarks in under a minute, maybe I can start again with the Prof and then come to Hannah, and then we'll come to Christy and finally close with Dr. Kirit. So,
well, I think the simple answer is that, in the global environment now underpinned by growing levels of neo-mercantilism, protectionism, and the effects of Trump's trade wars, the nexus of South-South trade becomes increasingly important. The role of China in Africa is a contested one. It is controversial, but I think that China has made, if we take 1998 with China's opening up as a benchmark, China has made major and abiding commitments to the continent of Africa through the mechanism of the Forum for China-Africa Cooperation, where it has incrementally, increased its investment, expanded the scope of its activity, particularly on the supply side of infrastructure development, and it has made major commitments to enhancing market access in a reciprocal manner. At a time when the United States is closing off, the entry points for Africa countries' access into the American market, through AGOA, via the tariffs. I mean, Trump's tariffs on certain African countries, particularly mine, South Africa, for 30-40%, really renders nugatory the kind of market access benefits that countries enjoyed, through the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act. By contrast, China has now adopted a much more permissive market access regime for African countries into its market, through identifying certain kinds of products that African countries should concentrate on in terms of manufactured export, a basket of manufactured products that could enter the Chinese market duty-free. So I think those are the opportunities, and this in particular is where the connections between the external environment, particularly on the global south side, become very important in building the platforms of export capacity through the African continental free trade area. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Prof. Hannah, your closing intervention in a minute?
Yes, I'll keep it very brief. I agree with what Dr. Garth has already mentioned, but just building on how global South countries can better support African regional integration. A great example is what Dr. Garth mentioned regarding the China's June 2025 duty-free, quota-free market access agreement that is offered to African countries. And what is good about this agreement is two things. First, it aligns with our first proposition that a new generation of trade agreements must be development-oriented and strategically sequenced. And this occurs by allowing African countries non-reciprocal access while also allowing them to sequence their own markets or open up their own markets based on individual country priorities. And the second good thing about this agreement is that it enables the continent-wide inclusion, as it also includes countries like South Africa, providing a duty-free, quota-free market access to 53 African countries instead of reinforcing the traditional geographical and developmental divides across the continent. And a final point is when it comes to looking at the negotiations of the China-Africa agreement, we see that it is development oriented in the sense that there are discussions over how do we make debt more sustainable and manageable, which China pledged to restructure or cancel portions of bilateral debt and offer a blended financial mechanism. And the final point is on the industrialization and value addition, which China is already supporting African countries through expanded support for special economic zones, industrial parks, and as Dr. Garth mentioned, the infrastructure support for greater integration into green value chains and renewable energy. So I'll leave it here, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We come to you, Christy, your closing remarks, and you can also attempt to respond to that last question.
Yeah. Also to the Africa questions, I think not only China, but also Japan, South Korea is also coming to Africa. I also studied that issue, this free trade agreement, and trying to find how Taiwanese companies, not government, but company can cooperate further with African country. And I found that Taiwanese investors in certain African country can actually take advantage of the free trade agreement, because they can use this preferential scheme among different African countries to move into the whole region. So I think Africa country should not exclude cooperation with other countries. China is very important, right? But there are still other companies and other countries that would also like to further cooperate with Africa. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Christy. And finally, Dr. Parikh, you have the last word. Please, let's hear your closing remarks. Is he still here?
Dr. Kate, I think you're on mute.
Dr.
Yeah,
Parikh, yes.
I think South-South trade is important from 2 points of view. One is that, they have much more complementarity and comparability in their economy. So you find that there is a trade between them somewhat equals. The second is that the distance is an important part. And we have seen that the transport can be easily disrupted by blockades or whatever you call it. So I think it is important that we at least exploit the trade with our neighbors who are very close and easy and have similar understandings and so on. But I think South-South trade can be very beneficial because we are not dominated by one country's powerful technology and so on.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks so much. So on that note, we've come to the end of today's session. Thank you very much to all our speakers, Dr. Kirit Parikh, Hannah Alwakil, Dr. Garth, and Christy. We very much appreciate your contribution to today's discussion. Thank you to our fantastic audience for the questions and for being here. We hope that this session has been useful to you. And lastly, I'd like to thank CATS International for convening this very important dialogue We see the utility of this, and we hope that you'll have more of this going forward. So with that, I'd like to bring this to an end and wish you all a wonderful rest of your day. Have a good afternoon or evening. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you very
Goodbye.
much.
Thank you.
Thank
Goodbye.
you.